Fox Lake Police Lieutenant Charles Joseph GLINIEWICZ.
Charles GLINIEWICZ, everybody called him Joe.
A police officer was gunned down.
The death of a Lake County, Illinois police officer.
Around 8, somewhere around 8 or 9 in the morning on September 1st of 2015, there was a lot of radio traffic indicating that a police officer had been shot. We knew he was shot before we knew he was dead. Then we knew that there were suspects that they were looking for. The suspects came from a description that he gave of the people he was pursuing before the shooting happened. So what we knew we had was the shooting of a police officer, but in Fox Lake, particularly in the morning on, I believe, what was a Tuesday. That is not the kind of thing that tends to happen, and it obviously was a pretty jarring thing. We found out that he had died, and then that was followed by this giant manhunt. There were dogs and helicopters, and the largest law enforcement response you could potentially imagine. Pretty hectic, trying to put together exactly what was going on. At first, it was basically trying to figure out, who shot this guy, where are they going to find him? I would say that things started to seem a little unusual to some people when they didn't find anybody. So, fairly early in the investigation, public officials on the record, started to say things that suggested that not everybody was completely sold on the idea that this was a homicide or a murder.
And you were giving the benefit of the doubt, I'm guessing, right away, because, who on earth would do this, especially an officer of the law, while searching had been going on and on for days for these 3 mysterious people.
Anything more about the description of the men who took off running?
No, it's all we have so far, and unfortunately, like Detective Cavelli said, last night was an unfortunate incident. It tied up a number of resources, including my detectives, who were called in and put on standby. They could have been out there in the field following up on leads. Instead, we were waiting for what we thought to be something significant, and unfortunately, it turned into nothing.
Fairly quickly, there opened up a rift between the Lake County coroner and some of the other officials, with the Lake County coroner saying he was not going to necessarily rule it a homicide, as in a killing by another person, leaving open the possibility that it could be a suicide. The media started asking questions, stories started dribbling out, and basically for the following weeks, there was this huge open question of what happened to this guy that was driven by things that people involved in the investigation were saying, that was driven by what the coroner was saying about the ruling.
What was it that stood out so early on in that case that came into your office?
Well, first of all, the fatal gunshot wound, which was between the first and second ribs, was located 2 inches under the bulletproof vest, which means the gun had to be very close and shoved under the vest for that shot to occur. So that was very, very unusual. That means it was close range. Secondly, the officer's uniform was in roll call shape, meaning that the shirt was in proper position, the pants were in proper position, the bulletproof vest was in proper position, which indicated there was no struggle. And that was confirmed when we did the autopsy, where there was no defensive wounds on the arms, the hands, the chest, the legs. So the manner of death, in my eyes, was not clear-cut. I needed more evidence. I needed the gunshot residue. I needed the DNA. I needed fingerprints. I need the psychosocial history. So as far as I was concerned, all 3 categories of manner of death were open.
I think you would say a climate of some skepticism about the things that Lake County law enforcement said, because they'd been proven to be wrong about things over and over and over again in the past, and had shown themselves to be fairly resolute in defending conclusions that flew in the face of evidence.
The suburbs are pretty much the Wild West. We really don't have good information on what goes on in the suburbs because There are too many. There is no news media that consistently covers all the suburbs.
I should say that his personnel file detailed a fairly hair-raising history of improprieties on his part, including a couple of drunken episodes earlier in his career, some kind of threatening behavior with a subordinate, and a lawsuit that the city settled, wherein they had acknowledged that he had sex with a subordinate.
In suburban areas, they don't have an inspector general. They don't have other mechanisms that would be in place in a larger city like Chicago, where we have layers, which still might not catch it and still might not correct it, but at least we have more experience and several layers of possible ways of at least catching the police abuse.
The Major Crimes Task Force and and other law enforcement agencies went forward in the belief that this was a homicide for a couple of weeks. Then apparently at some point their ideas about that changed, and they came out, it may have been November or December, by the time they came out and said, okay, this was a suicide.
We're here this morning to wrap up the investigation into the death of Lieutenant Charles Joseph GLINIEWICZ. This extensive investigation has concluded with an overwhelming amount of evidence that GLINIEWICZ's death was a carefully staged suicide.
So the first week or so of this, there's, GLINIEWICZ is a great hero. GLINIEWICZ is a wonderful family man. GLINIEWICZ is, he's everything a police officer should be. And that narrative worked for a while, like they had this funeral where, he was celebrated and praised and all that. And all the while, I guess what I always wondered since it came out what really happened is, what were the people who had some idea of the truth? What were they thinking when this was going on? And I still don't know the answer to that, and it bothers me. Like, what was their take on seeing this guy celebrated when they knew that there was reason to think that he wasn't who everybody was saying he was?
Police officers are thought to be the enforcers of the law and always following the law. So when there are complaints against police officers by civilians, frequently those are dismissed as not being accurate.
What happens if you're the person who knows all this stuff about him and you're watching it on TV? I don't know.
Do you personally have any regrets about the way you handled it?
No, I don't.